After 3 years of struggle, the Dutch and the Indonesians are still fighting for control. But in 1948, other parties loom on the horizon, hoping to use the chaos to transform Indonesia into a communist people's republic or an Islamic caliphate. This becomes a dilemma for the United States. Support decolonization and maybe end up with one of those, or an anti-communist Dutch colonial empire. Welcome to the Indonesian War of Independence, a Time Goes miniseries that follows that struggle year by year from 1945 to 1949. I'm Indy Neidell. Last year, the Dutch launched an offensive to regain control over economic strongpoints, an offensive they euphemistically called police actions. Though a military victory for the Dutch, they are now stuck with territory too large to manage, guerrilla fighters behind their lines, and a still functioning Indonesian Republican government. Then a ceasefire was declared by the UN, and the Dutch and the Indonesians again came to the table to discuss the future of the Indonesian archipelago. That ultimately leads to the Renville Agreement, which is ratified in January 1948. Now, it is very similar to the Linggajati Agreement, which aimed to divide Indonesia into 3 states, together forming the United States of Indonesia as a sovereign state under the Dutch crown. One of these states, consisting of Sumatra, Java, and Madura, would be governed by the Indonesian Republican government. But the Renville Agreement makes a demarcation line that is recognized as a temporary border, giving a lot of power to the Dutch in the Republican territories. And the Dutch would keep West Java and East Sumatra, a significant downgrade for the Republicans compared to Linggajati. Furthermore, the other 2 states are really just puppet states in this agreement, allowing the Dutch to limit Republican power even further. But the Dutch, trying to cling to their former empire at all costs, seriously disturbs the international community, particularly the USA. They are presented with a dilemma, as I said. Philosophically and historically, the US is generally sympathetic to anti-colonial nationalist movements for self-rule, a concept that gained worldwide traction after World War I. However, after World War II, the US took up a new role as protector of the world order. And a major fear now is that post-colonialism will offer a means for communist movements to take over. So how should they handle a situation where the Netherlands, an ally, is fighting an anti-colonial movement against self-rule, while at the same time, communist and Islamist movements are on the rise there? Okay, let's zoom out a little here. We're in the early stages of decolonization after World War II. India just gained independence from Britain last year after many years of struggle. The British are now also struggling with independence movements in other parts of their empire, like Malaya. But the first major country in East Asia to gain independence is the Philippines, which was under American control from 1898. In 1935, Congress passed an act to grant the Philippines independence after 10 years, and President Harry Truman signed Philippine independence on April 4th, 1946. This all fit in with America moving away from the expansionism and imperialism of the late 1800s to the isolationism of the 1920s. Woodrow Wilson's 14 points wrote out the principles on which a post-World War I world order should ideally be based, of which self-determination was one of the pillars. Franklin Roosevelt expanded on this, and his wife does so now after his death. Here in 1948, Eleanor Roosevelt and President Truman are key figures in promoting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations. The Declaration says, in Article 21, that the will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of government. This will shall be expressed in periodic and genuine elections, which shall be by universal and equal suffrage, and shall be held by secret vote or by equivalent free voting procedure. This effectively and publicly condemns involuntary colonization by a foreign power. But sometimes words are not enough to bring forth real change, because while the will to grant freedom to everyone may be part of American foreign policy, so too is protecting the post-war order that they paid for with American lives. And the fear of communist uprisings is very real. Countries like the Philippines, China, Korea, Indochina, Indonesia have active communist parties, all aiming to take advantage of post-war power vacuums. So an American priority is also to have countries ruled by governments that can deal with communist insurgencies. The Dutch play on American fears, framing the Indonesians as backwards and ignorant. And the Americans certainly want Indonesia, a key strategic location, within their sphere of influence. And anti-Western sentiments, or God forbid, a communist revolution, endanger American interests. However, as the Dutch proved to be unable so far to regain control in Indonesia, and with continuing violence threatening the economic stability of the region, the US is starting to doubt if the Dutch are the right people for the job. For their part, while the Dutch might not care for that evaluation, they are economically and militarily dependent on the United States. They used the Lend-Lease program to arm themselves after the war, and they need those arms here in Indonesia. They also receive Marshall Plan aid from the Americans to rebuild the Netherlands. And this gives the Americans a real pressure point. But how tangible really is the Dutch claim that they, and only they, can protect Indonesia from undesirable ideologies? Well, there are two main movements that come into play here. The first is called Darul Islam, which advocates an Islamic state of Indonesia. They set up their own army in 1947, and they gained ground following the signing of the Renville Agreement, which many people believe shows that the Republicans are not extreme enough in their pursuit of independence. The Islamic army stays in West Java, from which the Republicans had to withdraw under the agreement. And in May 1948, they established a proto-Islamic state there. They wage a guerrilla jihad against the Dutch, and over the following months successfully consolidate a military and political base of power, opposing both the Dutch and the Indonesian Republicans. And another ideology is regaining support. The Communist Party of Indonesia, the PKI, goes way back. In fact, it was the first communist party in Asia. As we saw in the prelude, they became irrelevant after a failed uprising in the 1920s, but now they're back. At the beginning of the Indonesian Revolution, they kept a low profile to avoid antagonizing the US and Britain, knowing full well that those guys would never allow a communist regime to govern Indonesia. But the Indonesian Socialist Party now splits in two, with one party actively pursuing a communist revolution. The two new movements are led by the first two prime ministers of the Indonesian Republic. The first prime minister, Sultan Syahrir, forms a new socialist party and continues to support Muhammad Hatta's Republican government. It is the second one, under Amir Syarifuddin, that radicalizes and founds the FDR party, Front Demokrasi Rakyat. Now, as we enter the Cold War era, you can see Moscow's efforts to give the new communist movement a little push. A communist Indonesia would be a big win for the Soviets. So in a dramatic series of events, an Indonesian government representative enters into diplomatic relations with the Soviets on behalf of the Indonesian Republic, even though the Republicans do not want to engage in foreign politics before resolving their own revolution. Muhammad Hatta feels forced to distance himself from this, not wishing to upset the US. The FDR party uses that to frame the Republicans as pro-imperialist. And to make things worse for Hatta's government, that representative returns to Indonesia with his secretary Musso, who is in fact a veteran high-ranking communist who has lived and studied in the USSR for years and who plans to lead the revolution to bring forth a communist state by force. Fighting breaks out between FDR militias and the Republican Army. Many of the latter are from the staunchly anti-communist Siliwangi division from Solo, the second largest city on Java. This also happens to be the main city of communist activities, though. Intense fighting breaks out in the streets of Solo, and members from both the FDR and the Communist Party are kidnapped and murdered. Soon the fighting spreads to Madiun, the third city of the Republic. See, here, local communist leader Sumarsono has been ordered by the FDR to make land reforms, reallocating lands by force. To preempt Republican retaliation, Sumarsono strikes against Republican forces in Madiun. The FDR take big parts of the city, but their success is short-lived. Within 10 days, the Republicans recapture Madiun, and over the next 2 months, obliterate the FDR's guerrilla forces, capturing and executing the majority of the communist leaders. The Americans are quite impressed with how the Republicans handled the communist uprising. The Madiun affair shows that indigenous people can be perfectly good at protecting U.S. interests. The Americans were already skeptical of the Dutch for their ineffective and violent handling of the situation, but now lose virtually all interest in protecting Dutch interests in Indonesia. They are of the opinion that it's the Netherlands' turn to make concessions. Now, negotiations came to a halt after the signing of the Renville Agreement. The Dutch feel like they're in a pretty good place. They have the military high ground, they control important economic assets, they are definitely not interested in making concessions. On the contrary, they confidently set up the remaining states for the United States of Indonesia and form a provisional federal government. The Indonesian Republicans do not support any of this and refrain from taking any part in this government. And it doesn't take long before voices for another Dutch military offensive resurface. The Republican dissidents must be dealt with once and for all. But you know, the Dutch kind of have a lot to lose here. Their first military actions resulted in an international scandal, and the Dutch still rely on martial aid. They would maybe lose that if they now launch a new colonial offensive. The communist revolution seemed like a good excuse to restore order, but that ship has sailed. But they decide to take the leap and launch that military offensive, which they call the Second Police Actions. Officially listing Republican violations of the truce, the Dutch launch Operation Crow December 19, 1948. An army of 140,000 troops pours into Republican territory. Paratroops are dropped on the airfield of Yogyakarta, the Republican capital. The city falls in hours, and many principal Republican leaders, including Hatta and Sukarno, are captured. Other units make their way to the center of Java from the west and from the east. The Republican army avoids any head-on fighting with the Dutch, knowing it cannot win such a battle. Within 2 weeks, the Dutch conquer most Republican strongholds on Sumatra and Java. But since the Republican army still exists, the Dutch victory is not decisive. Guerrilla fighting continues, and though the Dutch try to mop up resistance, a UN resolution puts a stop to it. See, by now, the international community is furious with the Dutch. On January 13, 1949, the New York Times writes that the Dutch received $400 million in martial aid to rebuild the Netherlands and spent $430 million to maintain their army in Indonesia. But despite giving a firm warning and suspending martial aid to the Dutch East Indies, the US does not cancel martial aid to the Netherlands, claiming that, quote, economic aid should not be used for political purposes, like pressuring the Dutch to give up their colony. Behind closed doors, the Americans fear that alienating the Dutch might antagonize other colonial powers and ultimately endanger stability within Europe. But that's where we are at the end of 1948. American ideals of self-determination, well, were mostly still just words, as the Dutch resort to another military offensive to try to remove the Republicans from power. And while they effectively do, the Republican leaders are now imprisoned or exiled. Those American words might soon become actions. The international community thinks that the Dutch are crossing a line, and the Indonesian Republican government has shown that it is able to act firmly and decisively as it did to suppress the communist revolution. It all keeps simmering to a boil. The Dutch in control on paper, the rest of the world out of patience, and the Indonesians refusing to give in. In 1949, it will all come to a dramatic and violent conclusion. If you would like to see how American help enabled the British, and later the Dutch, to get military aid without compromising American neutrality, you can see our World War II in real-time special on the Lend-Lease program right here. Our Time Ghost Army member of the week is Sean Young. The Time Ghost Army finances all our channels and all of our programming, and you can join at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Subscribe, ring the bell, see you next time.